A reading from the first book of Kings. The elders of Israel and all the leaders of the tribes, the princes and the ancestral houses of the children of Israel, came to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from the city of David, which is Zion. All the people of Israel assembled before King Solomon during the festival in the month of Ethanim. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark. They carried the ark of the Lord and the meeting tent with all the sacred vessels that were in the tent. The priests and Levites carried them. King Solomon and the entire community of Israel, present for the occasion, sacrificed before the ark sheep and oxen, too many to number or count. The priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place beneath the wings of the cherubim in the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies of the temple. The cherubim had their wings spread out over the place of the ark, sheltering the ark and its poles from above. There was nothing in the ark but the 2 stone tablets which Moses had put there in Horeb. When the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel at their departure from the land of Egypt. When the priests left the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, so that the priests could no longer minister because of the cloud, since the Lord's glory had filled the temple of the Lord. Then Solomon said, "The Lord intends to dwell in the dark cloud. I have truly built you a princely house, a dwelling where you may abide forever." The word of the Lord. Lord, go up to the place of your rest. Lord, go up to the place of your rest. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us enter into his dwelling. Let us worship at his footstool. Lord, go up to the place of your rest. Advance, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your majesty. May your priests be clothed with justice. Let your faithful ones shout merrily for joy. For the sake of David, your servant, reject not the plea of your anointed. Lord, go up to the place of your rest.
Alleluia, 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 alleluia. Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom and cured every disease among the people. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. After making the crossing to the other side of the sea, Jesus and his disciples came to land at Gennesaret and tied up there. As they were leaving the boat, people immediately recognized him. They scurried about the surrounding country and began to bring in the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Whatever villages or towns or countryside he entered, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch only the tassel on his cloak. And as many as touched it were healed. The Gospel of the Lord. So the next couple of days, we get to read from your favorite chapter from the Old Testament, the chapter that all of you have probably memorized, you probably read on a daily basis, the 8th chapter of the first book of Kings, right? This most famous of chapters. Not really. Okay? It's one of those chapters of the Scriptures that many of us don't really know anything about. When I was finishing up seminary and I was writing my final paper on the book of Revelation, I actually studied this chapter rather in depth. I found that it is an extremely important chapter of the Old Testament. One of the reasons why many of us are not familiar with this chapter is because as modern Christians, we don't know very much about the temple of the Old Testament. And one of the things I learned as I was doing my studies on the book of Revelation is that really the only way to understand the entirety of the Scriptures and the book of Revelation is you have to understand the temple. And this isn't just a Catholic problem, this is a Christian problem. Part of the reason why it's a Christian problem is because even Protestants, when they try to learn about the temple, where do you go to learn about the temple? The temple's been gone for 2,000 years. Even if you go to a synagogue and to a Jewish service, it's nothing like the services of the Old Testament because there's no longer any temple. There's no longer any animal sacrifices. But the temple was the culmination of everything God was trying to do with the people of Israel from the very beginning, from the book of Genesis. And at the very end of the scriptures, once again we hear about the temple and the new Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. So the temple is a huge part of understanding the entirety of the scriptures. So we're going to be reading from this chapter the next couple of days. And I just want to make some comments about this, try to put some pieces together for you. One of the things I think is really amazing when you study the Bible is when you see all these things that seem separated and disconnected, and you're able to kind of put the pieces together and see the puzzle, right, all put together. And this chapter is very crucial for that. So what I want to point out today about this building of the temple is how it connects to the rest of salvation history. Right? I want to spend some time talking about that this morning. You guys who have been here the last couple of weeks for Mass, you've heard me talk about the books of Samuel, which took place just before this. And I talked about how basically when the Israelites came into the promised land, right, this land that was promised to them, that God promised that they would conquer, they weren't able to conquer the land right away. It took a couple of centuries because the people were unfaithful. So finally, at the time of King David, David conquered all of the land of Israel, and he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, which was the last city which had not been conquered yet. And David's son Solomon took it upon himself to build a house, or to build the temple for God, where the Ark of the Covenant could dwell. So a question that should arise is, why Jerusalem? Why was Jerusalem so important? Why was it so significant? As a matter of fact, if you read the entire Pentateuch, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, those first 5 books of the Bible, Jerusalem is never mentioned by name. And yet for the rest of the Old Testament, Jerusalem is this most important city of God, the capital city. Why? Why was it Jerusalem that was so important? Why was it Jerusalem where the temple was supposed to be built? That's the connecting piece. The connecting piece is that Jerusalem, although not mentioned by name explicitly earlier in the Old Testament, was actually mentioned. From the book of Chronicles, we know that Jerusalem is the place where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. Right? Strange connection there. It was the same place where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and it was the same place where there was a famous priest king of old in Genesis chapter 14. Anybody know who I'm talking about? The priest of the Most High God, the king of righteousness. Anybody remember him? Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which we know from Psalm 76 is Jerusalem. It's Zion. So it's the same place where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. It's the same place where Melchizedek was the famous king of righteousness who offered bread and wine in a thanksgiving sacrifice, a Eucharistic sacrifice to God. Right? So those are some clues. Now, here's the more debated thing, which I want to point out today, is that there was a further connection back in the Old Testament. I would argue and suggest that Jerusalem is the very place where the Garden of Eden originally was. So when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were kicked out of the east of the temple. And eventually their descendants ended up in Babylon, where they built the Tower of Babel. Abraham famously left that land and went west, back, presumably, to the land of Eden. When God told Abraham that he was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, he said, "I will point out the place to you." Why did God choose that specific place? Presumably it had some significance earlier on. The Garden of Eden, we know from the book of Genesis and from the book of Ezekiel, was actually not just simply a garden, but it was a mountain, right? Just like the mountain where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. All these different connections. And even when the Israelites built the temple, they made it out of different materials that were reminiscent back to the Garden of Eden. As a matter of fact, one of the rivers that flowed out of Jerusalem, they called the Gihon. That was the exact same name as one of the rivers mentioned in the book of Genesis, describing the Garden of Eden. All of these connections here. Right? So why does this matter? It matters because in the beginning, God placed humanity in the garden, Adam as its representative, and because of the sin of Adam and Eve, they were kicked out of God's presence. And basically, the entire story of the rest of salvation history is God trying to bring us back into his presence. First with the building of the tabernacle, then of the temple, and now in our day as Catholics, we don't have to go to some temple in Jerusalem. We can go to any Catholic church to be welcomed back into God's presence. Now, one last thing I just want to point out about this, and we'll continue talking tomorrow. Again, I said this is a suggestion. This is something that is hotly debated, and one of the things that many scholars don't attest to. But if you ever go to the Holy Land, interestingly enough, there is a little chapel about 20 feet underneath Mount Calvary. And legend goes that that is the place where Adam himself is buried. And that when the blood from the cross from the side of Jesus dripped down into the ground, they say that it went down to where Adam himself lays. If you ever go to Jerusalem, the tour guide will tell you it's mere legend. But it's because they're completely unaware of all these different connections that I've been pointing out to you this morning. Pretty amazing. All of these things are connected. There's no useless details in the Bible. And when we begin to put these pieces together and connect them, it's really exciting.